Danger, Noah, danger.
Hey guys, Alec Miller here, and I want to talk about Star Wars. I've been wanting to start these videos for a long time where I talk about different topics, and I couldn't find a great one to start with, and I've decided though that Star Wars would be the perfect one because I'm so passionate about it and consider myself an expert on it, having been a fan since I was 5 years old when I watched the re-release. I have the career I have because of Star Wars. You're not a nerd because you've watched every Star Wars movie, right? Or because you've gone to a midnight showing. Like 2/3 of America has done that. You're a nerd when you go and paint your own Boba Fett helmet. You're a nerd when you spent your high school years making lightsaber videos and hand painting on the lightsaber beams over the PVC pipes that you were using in the videos. That's what makes you a nerd, and that's what I am, a huge Star Wars nerd. I love Star Wars. I've even seen Star Wars holiday special.
Well, let's get off this galactic raindrop.
And also Ewoks, the movie, which are both awful.
An incredible adventure beyond imagination.
There's no escape for you, my little one.
Must have hope, must escape.
I want to make this clear that I'm not gatekeeping right here. I recorded this afterward because I realized it could sound like that. I'm not saying that your love for Star Wars isn't valid. You could love it just as much or more than me, part of it, right? Your exposure to Star Wars doesn't limit your love of Star Wars. I'm just trying to explain where I'm coming from in my own life. So that being said, let's get on with the video. This first video, I want to talk about what Star Wars is. Because I think a lot of people get this fundamentally wrong, and it's going to matter a lot for every other topic I discuss. So one of the big problems about Star Wars and what Star Wars is people mislabel it. A lot of people say Star Wars is science fiction. If you watch the news and someone talks about the new Star Wars movie, the new science fiction hit, Star Wars, right? Or you'll hear Neil deGrasse Tyson complain about the physics in Star Wars and how BB-8 wouldn't have been able to move around, or how light doesn't stop whenever you want it to. And the problem with that is it's not science fiction, okay? If you label Star Wars as science fiction, you're wrong. Star Wars is a fantasy novel, and comparing Star Wars and Star Trek makes just about as much sense as comparing Isaac Asimov and J.R.R. Tolkien. They're two completely different genres that have nothing to do with each other. So in order to be science fiction, you have to be based in science. Just like in order to be historical fiction, you have to be based in history. Star Wars isn't historical fiction because it didn't historically happen. And it's not science fiction because there's no science in it. Never once do they sit there and explain, well, here's how the blaster works. It's this. I mean, there's books that do that, but Star Wars itself is not science fiction. Star Wars itself is space fantasy. You have wizards. You have knights. You have spaceships and pirates and rogues and an evil emperor that has a princess who's held captive. That's what Star Wars is, right? You have a giant furry companion called a Wookiee. That doesn't exist in science fiction. Not good science fiction anyway. It's important. It's important because it's key to the understanding what Star Wars is and what it isn't, and which complaints are valid and which aren't. Okay, so when someone complains about Star Wars and says, well, if you were ever in space, your insides would implode. It's like, yeah, okay, but there also wouldn't be any sound in space. You can't just jump to light speed and jump out of light speed without your entire spaceship and everyone in it being ripped to shreds. Those aren't valid complaints because Star Wars isn't science fiction. So that's just a small example of why it's important to know what the definition of Star Wars is, because that's going to decide on what type of feedback is valid or isn't. But it's a fantasy. It's where Japanese lore meets Knights and Dragons Tales, meets King Arthur, meets a little bit of World War II and in space. And that's what makes Star Wars so unique. There's nothing new under the sun, right? There's no new stories. And Star Wars by far is not the newest story. You can look and read exactly what it is that Lucas read to get to the story he has Luke go through. But what it does do that is unique is compile many different ideas that had never been compiled in that way before. And that's what makes Star Wars so cool. That's also why the prequels feel so bad. If you watch 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, the biggest difference is where the inspiration is being drawn from. And it's actually a big problem with 1, 2, and 3 is that the inspiration for 1, 2, and 3 is being drawn from itself, versus 4, 5, and 6, the inspiration is being drawn from, like I said, Japanese lore, World War II, medieval knights. 1, 2, and 3, it's kind of self-referencing. There's some NASCAR in there, there's some other stuff in there. The sources are very different, and that's what makes it feel so different, is it didn't use the same source of inspiration that the first ones did. New Star Wars movies, 7, 8, and 9, and 1, 2, and 3 actually suffer from many of the same problems. And if you watch them all together, you'll understand this. Hear me out. They're being inspired by other Star Wars movies. And so when you do that, you run into trouble, and it limits the movies you can make. And that's why, by the way, I think so many people really like Rogue One, is that's clearly inspired by going back to World War II and getting away from just being inspired by other Star Wars movies, right? It's not a movie that's self-referential. It's a movie that stands on its own because it's inspired by things outside of the universe that it's in. So when someone says that Star Wars is science fiction, they're wrong. When someone tries to compare it to something like Star Trek, they're wrong. It's apples and oranges. What we love about Star Wars is the fact that it's a fantasy, right? It's the fact that it's about knights and princesses and rogues and scoundrels. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you agreed with it, share it with other people so that they can also hear my opinions and your opinions because you agreed with it. Or if you disagree with it, leave me a comment. Let me know. I want to talk about this and I want to hone these ideas. I don't think I'm right about everything, despite what my wife might tell you. I think that there's always room to grow. My goal with these videos is to create a discussion. I see a lot of people online and on Facebook and all over the place writing these very strong opinions and just stating them and yelling them, and other people saying you're wrong and I'm saying right. What I want to do is actually think. Let's get a little deeper here, right? Let's talk about what Star Wars is, what it isn't, and then from here, this will be a great jumping off point to get into larger things about society. Stay tuned for more of these sort of videos, and they're going to start on Star Wars, and they're slowly going to branch into other topics. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.